The Ask the Experts Theater at CSEMP Edge is sponsored by Gaines.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session today, sponsored by Trew. My name is Webb. I'm the VP, it says there, data science. I've since changed my roles. I'm also the VP of customer support and solutions strategist for Trew Automation. So who is Trew? Real quickly, Trew is a systems integrator for warehouse automation. We manufacture our own conveyor, sortation equipment. We have our own WES software, WCS controls, electrical, do our own installation, and then we integrate third-party technologies like the folks from OPEX are here in the audience, their technologies into our solutions. That's enough about me and them. Well, I guess I would add, so why am I here talking to you today, and why am I qualified to talk to you today? And that is, so I've sat on both sides of the fence, about 20 plus years on the customer side, managing warehouses all the way from the 70s into the late 90s. Then I joined what was then Pinnacle Automation to begin doing solution development through data analytics, consulting, and coming up with solutions that solved unique problems for our customers. So let's get started. Today's talk is about resilience. We hear a lot about supply chain resilience, enough that it's really become a lot of marketing hype to some point. But it does have a reality. I mean, I don't think any of us would disagree that there's a lot of disruption today in our warehouses, in our supply chains. And then, how do we take that disruption and turn it into opportunities? Because those disruptions are not going to go away. So that's what we're talking about today. Whoops. There we go. So why is it so important? Why does resilience matter? Well, in the past, those disruptions were fairly predictable. I remember back in the 80s and the 90s when I was in distribution centers, you had your weather events, you had certain geopolitical events, but they were fairly predictable and you knew how you were going to respond to them. Well, in the present day, those disruptions, those uncertainties have become more frequent. They have become more unmeasurable, less predictable, and more complex. And so in the future, these are not going to go away. What's going to happen is, instead of being linear, these disruptions, these problems are going to affect our warehouses in a more compound manner. They're going to start stacking up on top of each other. As I begin to think about just think about one, for example, would be all of the challenges that now face our warehouses because of something as simple as social media, right? So it's not been that long ago now that we've had this disruption where someone can go on TikTok or some other social media platform, and then all of a sudden you have a spike in your warehouse for these pink leather shoes, right? That you never had before. You didn't plan on it. They were slow movers, and now all of a sudden they're moving like gangbusters. That's the kind of disruptions that, on top of all the other geopolitical, weather, and everything else, SKU profiles, mergers, acquisitions that we want to talk about. And then how do we turn those disruptions, again, into opportunities? Must not be. Oh, it was working. There we go. So before, went too far. Bear with me. My clicker. There we go. So when I begin to think about this, I think of the foundations of how I would define resilience if I was in a warehouse, right? Because if I don't understand what resilience is, if I don't have a definition of it, well then how can I then turn that into an opportunity? How can I then turn that into a competitive edge? And so here is basically how I define it with these 8 cornerstones. And I won't go into each one. You can kind of see them for yourself. I just want to touch on a few of them. One would be strategic adaptability. Adaptability just doesn't happen. it has to be something that you plan for. It has to be strategic. You have to have a workbook that you can go to and your operators can go to so that they know how to react when certain things happen. There also needs to be an operational balance. You can't simply flex your operation and then wait later to see what the costs were for what you chose to decide. We want to be able to flex against a disruption and still maintain our cost per piece. If we can't do that, then we're no longer competitive. The other thing I want to mention here is just the flexible infrastructure. And we will be talking about, obviously, automation today. Not all automation, I think every piece of automation has a fit. Not every automation is flexible in the way that you need it to be flexible. And that's how you need to think about it, not just because someone describes it as being flexible. It's, again, how your automation compares to these 8 cornerstones, right? Because when we take these 8 cornerstones, we need a catalyst. So think of the cornerstones as your car. You got wheels, you got a body, you got a motor, you got everything you need for your car. But without the combustion, without the gasoline to propel it, it's worthless, right? So we want to talk about those catalysts that provide that combustion. And the way I think of those as a catalyst, you're looking for things that can scale. And I'm not talking about necessarily scale 5 years out of growth, right? And now you need to expand. Yes, you need to consider that. But I want you also thinking about scale every day, every hour of your operation. So what happens when your order profile changes or your order velocity changes midday? How do you scale in order to achieve the throughput that you need for that day? The other thing that I think when we look at a catalyst, what it has to do is it has to reduce the dependencies, because dependencies is where we begin to introduce variation, and we can't absorb that variation very efficiently. So one of those dependencies is obviously labor, right? So wherever we can absorb labor and reduce our dependency on labor, that again will give us some catalyst for resilience. And all that will lead us to a right-fitting strategic solution for us. So what might be some of the automation that you would look at for resilience, to overcome disruption? And again, the things I'm going to talk about, within each one, there may be a solution, a particular technology within that is not as flexible or not flexible in the way you need it to be. So we want to talk about your operation and how these things fit. So we hear a lot about autonomous robots and robotics. They provide flexibility, scalability, all the other hype words, right? And I would say this, the intention there is that autonomous vehicles can change workflows, right, without major changes or without major, infrastructure changes. You can, in other words, if you have a robot with LiDAR, and you put something in its way that is this normal path, it can go around that to continue on its path. Well, not all robots, not all autonomous robots are guided by LiDAR, for example. Some of them are guided by fiducials, right? And so, they're kind of stuck on that path, similar like it would be with conveyor. So just because you have an autonomous robot doesn't mean that you have that flexibility that, okay, something's down, I need to reroute, change my traffic path. Okay, can I actually do it? Or do I have to go down and put QR codes on the floor? If I got to put QR codes on the floor, then it's not going to happen, right? So when we look at robotics and autonomous systems, what we want to look for these particular solutions is that flexibility. Do they provide us the flexibility to get around workflows and to change workflows, right? To me, that's where the advantage that we would have, and have risk mitigation against, if something was to go down, we had a bottleneck, how can we then change that workflow? The other one would be ASRS and specifically goods to person solutions. There's a lot of them out there. But here's the things you want to look for, right? You want to remove that labor dependence. So obviously that's where things like throughput come in. How high of a throughput do you get out of a goods to person solution? So how many headcount do you actually reduce? But you have to make sure too that, okay, well, if an aisle goes down let's say in an ASRS solution, well, how do I get around that? Is there SKUs spread out in that ASRS system to where I can continue to complete my orders while I'm trying to get that aisle back up? If not, that should be a way that you measure it it's not as flexible as you may need, right? The other thing that goods to person systems bring to the table is speed. Right? With speed, you have not only the speed for throughput, but the speed for recovery, right? So for example, if you can get 500 picks per hour out of a goods to person solution per station, right? And let's say you only need 400, so you got a lot of headroom there. So that headroom will enable you to do two things. When your velocity picks up during the day, you'll be able to meet that velocity during your peak hour to still meet your SLAs for your customers. The other thing that it does is it gives you recovery, because if you go down, you have that extra headroom to then make it up potentially over the next hour or the next 2 hours, right? And obviously, depending on the type of goods to person solution, some more than others offer more space optimization or space utilization, depending on the density. I will say this, you have to compare, again, what your needs are. Because if I have a more dense solution, a lot of times what you'll find is the actual complexity that it is required to retrieve a SKU, for example, is more complex. It takes more time. My cycle time's not as high, right? Whereas if I have a solution that maybe is less dense, I have maybe 100% availability of all SKUs to all robots, right? So think about that. So again, you have to measure each one of these solutions against what your flexibility needs are, what your potential disruptions are. One thing that I heard in a session yesterday was, it was in the what is in the minds of the CEOs. And the one thing that stuck with me was they were saying that the CEOs need to focus on what is true, will always be consistent. For example, customers will never want a more expensive product. Customers will never want their orders to take longer, right? They'll always want their orders to be there quicker, sooner, cheaper, So those are the things that are true. So that's the things we need to do when we evaluate our warehouse for resilience is what are those things that we need to be consistent, right? And then we got to look at, well, how our automated solutions then allow us to continue to be consistent on those metrics. I'll skip over that one. I would say the next catalyst and one of the largest catalysts is a warehouse orchestration system. So I would explain a WOS as this, from a WES. So a warehouse execution system typically deals within silos, right? It has subsystems that it tries to manage, and it will execute tasks across those subsystems to make a throughput out the door. Well, a warehouse orchestration systems will actually look inside all those silos and be able to say, well, which tasks should be completed within this silo or within this subsystem so that I can optimize also that subsystem and this one so that I get that order out. I get that order out in the least amount of time and on time for my SLA, right? So the WOS is more overarching while it's also looking more into the details, right? It's trying to manage every task more specifically. All right. So the next thing that I think we can't forget about is predictive maintenance and Internet of Things and how that can help us. And basically it's this. It's about the speed of recovery and so that we don't have to recover, right? So if we have predictive measures within our maintenance, within our mechanical systems that'll tell us, oh, okay, we have a motor that's overheating, or we have a gear that needs to be replaced. So if we have that connectivity that can tell us that predictive maintenance, and then also what we have to look at is, okay, well, if something goes down with this particular solution, what is my mean time to return back to operation, right? So what's my mean time to recovery, my MTR? And you really need to dive down into the nuts and bolts of that. Is it, do I have to take a crane completely out of an aisle? How do I service it? Can I just take a robot out of an aisle? If I do I have to have a cart to do that? How do I get into the field? All those things. It's all about, when we think about disruption, it's about how do I get back up and running, up to speed, the fastest that I can. So then we can't forget about the human element. We can talk about AI, we can talk about automation all we want. The humans are not, in my opinion, are not going to go away. So it's then, how do we build a culture within our warehouse where every level has a plan book or a playbook about recovery, has a playbook about when this disruption happens, what do you do, so that when they get exceptions, when disruption happens, we don't have people on the floor that don't know how to deal with it. They're looking to escalate it up to some other person that they can't find, or it takes them an hour to get through the process. They want to be able, you want them to be able to deal with that problem, that disruption, right then and there, and get back to recovery. So it has to be embedded in our people. We have to train them, and we have to have human tech collaboration. And a lot of that is helping them understand what the technology is, what the metrics are that they need to read from that technology, so that they can then pull the right levers, right? We cannot rely on some AI to always choose what's right. That's not going to occur. We need that human to be able to take the information that maybe AI is giving it, but then they know how best to work that playbook. So they say, okay, well, I understand what you're recommending. I need to pull this lever. I need to change this workflow to make this happen, so that I'm not only containing throughput, but I'm maintaining my cost per piece. And that's what we're really driving down to is, okay, fine, if I can throw bodies at it and everything else, okay, you might get through the day, but you haven't contained your cost per piece. And if you can't contain your cost per piece, then you won't be competitive. So if nothing else, if you walk away from our talk today, is how do I get through disruptions and still be cost competitive? Okay? So there's all kinds of metrics we can talk about. I have some here. I have actually TTR on here twice, and I made a boo-boo here on the typo, on the typing. But one of it, when you think about TTR, it needs to be at the mechanical level, it needs to be at the subsystem level, and it needs to be at the system level, right? It has to be at each one, because just because you solve it at the mechanical level doesn't necessarily mean that you'll solve it at the system level. And so we're looking for things like order cycle time, because that's our speed, labor flexibility. So how fast and how well and how often do I have to move labor? Or how often do I have to flex my head count? That is not easy to do. And something else that you need to come up with on your own, really, and I can't tell you how to do this because it's a metric you really got to develop within your own system, and that's what I'm calling the resilience index score. So based on those 8 foundations, for example, you would go through and prioritize each one of those foundations, what they mean to your organization, what those things that we hold true to, throughput, cost per piece, all those things, and then say, okay, well, when you go and walk your floor, or you're looking at evaluating a automation system, okay, how does that line up with your resilience score? So then we've done all this to say that we need to use agility within the warehouse as a new competitive edge. Don't think of it as no longer as an excuse, right? And I'll point at myself. So whenever I'd have breakdowns, the sorter would break down in my warehouse. Yeah, I would throw bodies out, I'd get through the day, but my basically, I was given an excuse to my boss about, okay, well, now why was my cost a little higher that day, right? So this is all about, well, not having to give those excuses and learning how to introduce agility into our warehouses. And think about that this way. We want to be able to take the chaos, if any of you are actually in a warehouse, managing a warehouse, or have warehouses, you know that it's kind of like structured chaos every day because you never know what's going to happen. And so what we want to do is agility has become the competitive edge, and those that are successful with it will actually learn how to take that disruption, and that disruption is probably, or some version of it is happening to your competitors. But the difference is you knew how to take that disruption and still maintain your throughput, maintain your cost per piece. So now you maintain your competitive edge. And so we're looking at things like volatility basically becoming a baseline condition. That means we know it's coming. We may not know how fast, we don't know when, we don't know at what veracity, but we know it's coming and we have a playbook for it. And customer experience is our battlefield. We have to continue to keep our customers satisfied. If we don't, it affects our company margins, our profits, affects our performance within the warehouse. And then the other thing that we have to consider is labor fragility is not going to go away. Labor is going to continue to be a problem, and we're going to have to continue to invest in those solutions where it will reduce our labor dependency. And the other thing I would say this, when we talk about culture and people within our warehouse, is that the speed of learning is a multiplier. And here's what I mean by that. Going back to what I said earlier about where we have training, where we actually train people on the floor how to deal with disruption, how to deal with exceptions, right? That kind of training will be our multiplier because it's that kind of action that will then take that disruption that, yeah, we may have bought some mechanization, some solutions to help with that, but it's the decisions that are made by our people on the floor that will then get us out of that situation, right? We cannot rely on the mechanization to do it on its own, unfortunately. So, here's some metrics that I put up here that you might want to think about. I would suggest that you look at your own. But it's focused on customer satisfaction. Okay, well, during disruption, you still had an improvement in your scores rather than if you had the disruption and didn't do anything about it, what would have been your scores then, right? Responsiveness, your 30% faster reaction to demand changes. So often I hear today things like, or the social media thing that I mentioned earlier, where all of a sudden you get the orders for pink shoes, where that could actually almost shut down a warehouse for a day because, they were in the back of the warehouse, they were slow movers, you had 2 pieces in the forward pick, and all the rest of them were on pallets in reserve storage. And all of a sudden, because some social media influencer decided that they want to post a TikTok video, everybody now within the US wants to order those same pink shoes. So now you're scrambling to get those pink shoes out because not only did they order pink shoes, some of them just ordered them, some of them ordered a pink shoes with some brown shoes. So now you have a lot of marry-up problems. That's the things that we're trying to solve here. So what are some key takeaways? Number 1, disruption is inevitable. It is here to stay. So our job is to learn how to deal with it. Our job is not to just deal with it, but actually to advance and take advantage of it and to make something competitive out of it. Number 2, agility is multifaceted. We can't just be agile in one particular area. For example, we can't just be agile in, okay, well, if this ASRS goes down, here's what I do. We have to be agile throughout the organization, throughout our warehouse. Number 3, the right automation enables resilience, but you have to look at it and how it applies to your operation. And fourthly, as we've talked a lot about, is the culture. We have to enable and introduce and embed the thought of adaptation and getting over disruption, we have to embed that into our culture of our people. So what might be the next steps for you to say, okay, well, how do I start my journey onto resilient strategy? First thing, well, assess your current capabilities. Where are you at? Evaluate your throughput. Evaluate, well, what if, right? So a lot of times when I go through a warehouse, I go, well, what if this happens? What if this breaks? What if this backs up? What if your order profile changes? So ask those what ifs. That will tell you how well you can deal with disruption today and how fragile your warehouse may be. Number two, you got to define some strategic goals. You can't just say, I want to be resilient, right? So like I had the 8 cornerstones there, you have to define what that resilience is, and you have to put some goals to it with data. It can't be just fuzzy, okay, well, I want things to run well. Okay, great. You got to put things in it like TTR. Well, what is your goal to be up and running after an event, excuse me, on your system, your subsystem, some of your mechanical technologies? Then you have to take that and identify what automation opportunities are you looking for. What automation would actually satisfy or help you with your disruptions? Because your disruptions are not the same as your neighbors, your competitors, or anybody else's. They're not your goals. So you take your goals, your conditions, and find the automation that will allow you to be flexible. And you need to have those conversations with your automation providers. That needs to be part of it. Too often what I see from automation or from customers coming to automation providers is throughput. How many headcounts am I going to reduce and what's the rate? Well, that has nothing to do with, well, what happens if? And believe me, what happens if will happen. And it will happen again and again and again. So it's a matter of having those discussions with your warehouse automation provider and your tech that you're evaluating up front to say, well, how do we deal with what if, right? And it can't be always, the answer should not always be, well, with enough money and time, right? That should not be the answer. The answer should be, well, this design will allow you to, right? And there's going to be some limitations on it. But you need to understand what those limitations are. Next thing is we want to prioritize our investments based on our evaluation. Which ones actually achieve? And so this is the tough one because so often we just want to rely on a hard ROI, right? And we forget about the what ifs. And so then we go out and we invest a lot of capital in a solution. And then on day 2 that we're working, something happens, some what if. Our order profile changes, and we're sitting there going, well, what the heck? Well, your order profile changed. We didn't talk about that what if, right? So you want to have those discussions. You want to prioritize your investments based on your assessments. And then again, you want to institute those playbooks. From the top down, everybody needs to be working from the same playbook that says, when we see these conditions, when we see these symptoms, don't wait till it actually breaks. I mean, there will be times when it does, but we want to preemptively know what the symptoms are, what the signs are, just like our health, right? When we start feeling aches and pains, something wrong. So we have to assess why that happens before we land up in the hospital. It's the same thing here. We need to understand when we see things backing up, when we see a conveyor, for example, running empty. Well, why is it empty? Okay, there's something wrong. There should be product flowing on that conveyor, for example. We need to have those playbooks. And then we obviously need to develop the talent. We need to invest in people in our warehouse so that they can thrive and we can thrive as well. And the other thing is measure and iterate. What I mean by that is we want to have metrics that tell us when something, it is those symptoms, right, that it tells us, right? So when we see dashboards that tell us, okay, something is running lower here than it should be. We see more orders open than we normally do during this time. So any of those conditions, we want to have that, and we want to have it in a not only a graphical form, but a very meaningful data form that will allow us to take action. So much of what I see today in dashboards and metrics, yeah, it's good data, but it's just data. So a lot of times what I play is when I go into a warehouse, I see a dashboard is, I'm like, okay, so if this turns red or green or orange, what do you do? A lot of times the answer I get is, well, I pick up the phone and I call Joe. Okay, well, what does Joe do? And so what we're finding out is a lot of times these metrics aren't really, they're just noise. So what you want to do is you want to have the right metrics that are actually telling you ahead of time, and your operators need to be trained to recognize that so that they can turn those symptoms around quickly, because it's all about speed to recovery. And then when you institute your playbook, you have to trial it out, right? So it's a matter of, well, let's introduce or force a behavior. Let's force a disruption and see how our operation responds, right? We can't just sit back and wait for one to happen. Once we write our playbook, well, let's start introducing disruption and make sure that we're following our playbook. If we're not, let's train or let's modify our playbook and let's get moving on so that we have a better playbook, we have a better educated team. All right, so what's all this about? You know, your journey and resilience and warehouse automation, you know, I'm not going to stand up here and sell you on any particular automation. I'm just not going to do that. That's not what we're here about. I'm here to try to help educate you on your journey on how you can become more resilient in your warehouse. It's not just a hype word. It's something that we're going to have to do. Our warehouses are going to have to become more resilient because disruption is here to stay, and it's just going to get worse. Who knows what the next thing beyond social media, TikTok, like I talked about, is going to be? It's just around the corner. What's the next geopolitical problem that's going to happen? What's the new tariff? You know, what's the new weather event? They seem like they're always different, and the results are always different. So how do we plan for those, and what is our journey? And my response to you is, don't do it alone. There's experts out there in the industry that can help you, either in the consulting world or in the warehouse automation world. Go to those experts and talk it through and have a good dialogue, an honest dialogue about what happens if. Okay. So I want to open up, see if we have any questions. Still got plenty of time, about 10 minutes. Nope. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for attending. Hopefully you've been able to capture at least one little nugget out of this session. Thank you again for attending, and may you have a great day.